Let's make one thing clear right from the very beginning. A narcissist doesn't fall apart because they long for you or miss your presence. They unravel because your absence exposes a truth they've spent their entire life avoiding. And here's the part most people never realize. You were the one steady force holding their chaotic inner world together. You think you were fragile or powerless in that relationship. But wait until you see what happens when the only person who genuinely cared finally steps away. If this is already resonating with you, stay with me because what I'm about to explain next is exactly why their collapse is not and never was your burden to carry, and why walking away was the greatest act of self respect you've ever taken. When we say a narcissist doesn't lose people, they lose supply, we're saying something extremely important about how their emotional system works. Their emotional wiring is fundamentally different from yours. You attach to someone because of connection, shared meaning, closeness, empathy, and authentic care. A narcissist attaches for one reason only: usefulness. To them, you are not a partner in the emotional sense. You are a function, a resource, a psychological power source. But when the person they lose is someone who genuinely cared, the impact goes far deeper because that supply wasn't shallow. It was stabilizing, it was grounding, it was consistent. These are qualities a narcissist desperately needs but cannot create on their own. A caring person provides validation that is richer, steadier, and more nurturing than the superficial attention they constantly chase from others. It's the type of validation that temporarily makes them feel human instead of hollow, significant instead of brittle. They never consciously appreciate it, and they certainly never return it, but they depend on it in ways they never admit to anyone, including themselves. This form of supply isn't about ego stroking, it's about emotional containment. A caring person quiets their spiraling insecurities, softens their anger, steadies their moods, and tolerates their volatility. The narcissist doesn't interpret this as love, they interpret it as balance. You become the unseen buffer, keeping their inner chaos from completely spilling out into their life. So when they lose someone who truly cared, the crash is different. This supply cannot simply be swapped out. They can find attention anywhere. They can attract admiration, desire, obedience, or flattery with very little effort. But emotional steadiness, genuine presence, someone who sees their hidden pain even when they work hard to disguise it, that is rare. They don't fall apart because they loved you. They fall apart because your absence removes the internal scaffolding they were leaning on without even knowing it. It exposes the emotional emptiness they spend every day running from. The void feels sharper because the caring person filled it more effectively than anyone else. And that's why losing someone who genuinely cares destabilizes them so deeply. It reminds them that without external emotional support, they cannot maintain the identity or the stability they pretend they possess. When a narcissist loses someone who truly cared, they aren't just losing a companion or a comforting presence. They're being forced to face a psychological truth their entire personality is built to avoid at any cost: the emptiness inside them. Narcissism is built on a brittle sense of self that cannot soothe, regulate, or stabilize itself without help. Their entire life is centered around avoiding that inner void. Grandiosity, entitlement, shifting blame, controlling their image, charm, manipulation. None of these are random behaviors. They are survival mechanisms. Each one protects them from having to look inward. But when a caring person leaves, those defenses buckle just enough for reality to seep in. And that's when the loss hits with full force. A caring person functions as emotional insulation. They soften the narcissist's harsh edges, stabilize their emotional swings, and provide a sense of connection and continuity the narcissist cannot create internally. They become a steadying force even while being mistreated or overlooked. So when that stabilizing force vanishes, it is not just absence, it is exposure. Suddenly, the narcissist is left with the raw truth they've spent years refusing to confront. Without someone emotionally grounded beside them, they unravel quickly. The empty parts of them become harder to conceal behind charm or arrogance. The noise inside their mind grows louder because the calming presence that once muted it is no longer there. The loss also destroys one of the illusions they cling to most tightly, the belief that they are naturally desirable, irreplaceable, and worthy of unwavering devotion with no effort whatsoever. A caring person doesn't merely provide validation, they bring depth, they bring warmth, they bring humanity. Losing that forces the narcissist to face the uncomfortable possibility that they couldn't hold on to someone who was patient, empathetic, and deeply committed. This realization scratches at the core of their deepest shame, the suspicion that something is fundamentally defective within them. Rather than sit with that shame, they push it outward. They project, they blame, they devalue the person they lost. They rewrite the story so they can pretend they weren't the one who failed. But even with all this mental gymnastics, a specific discomfort lingers because a caring person saw them in ways shallow admirers never will. A caring person saw their fears, their emotional patterns, their fragility, and now that person is gone. The narcissist knows, whether consciously or just beneath awareness, that the only person who understood their chaos also chose to walk away from it. This loss briefly exposes the truth that they depend on others for emotional structure and even identity. And facing that truth, even indirectly, is one of the most destabilizing experiences a narcissist can endure. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, the destabilization that follows stems from a single crucial reality. Their entire sense of identity is external. Unlike emotionally healthy people who form a strong internal sense of self through reflection, accountability, growth, and self-awareness, a narcissist relies almost completely on outside validation to feel like a real person. Their self-worth is not internally generated, it is borrowed. Their identity is not stable, it is reactive. They exist as a reflection of how they believe others see them. That means every compliment, every reassurance, every sacrifice, every piece of emotional labor provided by a caring individual becomes part of their psychological structure. The caring person is not simply a partner, friend, or loved one. They are a mirror. They reflect back a version of the narcissist that feels admirable, significant, or superior. They help regulate the narcissist's moods, insecurities, and impulses simply by being steady and emotionally grounded. The narcissist unconsciously leans on this steadiness in order to maintain the illusion of having a coherent identity. But since this entire structure is external, it is also extremely fragile. When that caring presence leaves, the narcissist has nothing internal to fall back on. It is as if the lights suddenly go out in a room they were never taught how to navigate. They no longer have that stable emotional reflection telling them who they are. Without it, the persona they show the world begins to crack. This explains why their reactions seem so extreme. Explosive rage, panic, desperate attempts to replace you, sudden depression, reckless behavior. These aren't signs of heartbreak. They're signs of losing the psychological anchor that kept them from collapsing into their own emotional disarray. The caring person's validation acted as a stabilizing force, preventing their fragile self-esteem from completely imploding. And perhaps the bitterest irony is that the narcissist rarely understands how much of their identity depended on that stability until it is gone. They don't possess a strong internal core. They depend on the emotional energy of people around them, especially those who offer consistent empathy and care. So when that person walks away, the narcissist falls into a sudden void. The absence feels like psychological freefall because without external validation, their sense of self cannot hold together. Their identity was never resilient enough to withstand losing someone who provided emotional grounding. This is why the collapse is so intense. Losing someone who cared doesn't merely bruise their ego, it unravels the very foundation of the identity they tried so hard to maintain. A caring person often becomes something the narcissist subconsciously depends on, a barrier between them and their own emotional turbulence. Narcissists live with constant undercurrents of insecurity, shame, inadequacy, and emotional instability. These feelings are overwhelming, so they lean heavily on stable, empathetic people to absorb or soothe these inner storms. A caring partner becomes the emotional shock absorber of the relationship, taking on burdens the narcissist refuses to see or handle. This buffering shows up in countless subtle ways. The caring person interprets the narcissist's moods, mitigates conflicts, calms tension, explains their behavior to others, and keeps interactions smooth. They assist with responsibilities, support dreams, and shield the narcissist from the consequences of impulsive decisions. They step in when the narcissist is spiraling, panicking, or unraveling emotionally. Even when the narcissist lashes out cruelly, the caring person responds with patience, clarity, and empathy, traits the narcissist lacks. All of this creates a stabilizing environment. The narcissist uses this person's emotional competence as a substitute for their own. The caring partner organizes the emotional landscape of the relationship in ways the narcissist depends on more than they ever realize. And because it becomes normalized, the narcissist assumes this stability is automatic. They fail to see it comes from the effort and emotional strength of the caring person. But when that caring presence is removed, the narcissist is suddenly exposed to their own unmanaged emotional world. The chaos they've kept suppressed begins to surface. There is no one left to deflect their anger, soothe their anxiety, or stabilize their impulses. Their internal disarray spills outward as rage, confusion, depression, or impulsive behavior. They feel more irritable, more disorganized, more lost, not because they miss love, but because the person who once regulated their internal storms is no longer buffering them. There is no one calming, softening, or protecting them from themselves. This sudden exposure leaves them emotionally naked. They must now face the raw version of themselves, the one they've spent their entire life avoiding. And since they lack the ability to self-regulate, the inner chaos they once outsourced to the caring person now overwhelms them. Losing that buffer means losing the fragile equilibrium they depended on far more than they ever admitted. When a narcissist loses someone who truly cared, their typical coping strategies begin to malfunction. And this is one of the clearest signs of their internal collapse. Narcissists survive through denial, blame, rage, and quick emotional replacement. These strategies help them avoid responsibility, introspection, and emotional difficulty. But when the person they lose is someone who offered genuine grounding and emotional steadiness, those defenses fail to hold. the loss destabilizes them too deeply for their usual tactics to mask completely. One of the first signs is their inability to immediately replace the caring person with someone who serves the same emotional role. Narcissists can always find attention, praise, or superficial admiration. Those come easily, but what they cannot quickly replicate is the depth of emotional support the caring individual provided. Even if they rush into a new relationship or surround themselves with distractions, something feels hollow. The supply they obtain doesn't soothe, regulate, or shelter them from their internal volatility. This leaves them more reactive, anxious, and unsettled. Their denial, usually strong, begins to crack. Typically, they rewrite the story instantly. You were the problem. They never cared. You were forgettable. But when they lose someone who supported them, steadied them, and handled their emotional messiness, the lie is harder to maintain. They still say it, they still perform it, but internally, discomfort builds. A part of them knows that the stability they lost cannot be easily replaced by the next person. Their rage also becomes more unpredictable. Rage has always been their tool for regaining control, forcing the world to fall back in line. But after losing someone who was stabilizing them, rage doesn't provide the relief it once did. It intensifies the chaos. They lash out more, yet feel worse afterward. The anger no longer restores their power. It exposes their lack of it. They also begin drowning themselves in distractions, work, people, drama, addictions, anything to escape the collapse rising inside them. But because the new supply has no emotional depth, the distractions fade quickly. What once numbed them now barely takes the edge off. Their coping mechanisms fail because the loss isn't about ego alone. It's about losing the person who kept them emotionally regulated. Without that stabilizing presence, their old tactics no longer compensate for the inner instability. The strategies they've leaned on their entire life become hollow, ineffective, and unsatisfying, revealing the vulnerability they can no longer outrun. When a narcissist loses someone who truly cared, one of the most devastating internal consequences is the collapse of their grand internal narrative. This narrative is the story they tell themselves about who they are. In it, they are always the hero, the adored one, the innocent victim, the misunderstood genius, the righteous partner, or the irresistible figure. This narrative is the scaffolding that holds up their fragile ego. A caring person plays a crucial role in maintaining that narrative, not because they buy into the narcissist's fantasies, but because their emotional steadiness helps reduce the chaos that would otherwise expose the truth. The caring partner absorbs insecurity, supports goals, explains away behavior, offers compassion, and unintentionally shields the narcissist from the consequences of their own actions. They help keep the narcissist's internal story believable. But once that person is gone, the narrative begins to fracture. Suddenly, the narcissist cannot sustain the storyline where they are adored, exceptional, or blameless. They confront the uncomfortable reality that if they were truly the person they claim to be, they wouldn't have driven away someone who genuinely cared. This creates cognitive dissonance. Their story says, "I am special and people are lucky to be with me." Reality now says, "Someone who cared deeply chose to leave." The conflict between these two truths destabilizes them, so they frantically rewrite the narrative. They may demonize the person who left, calling them disloyal, unbalanced, dramatic, or ungrateful. They may cast themselves as the wounded victim. They twist the story to protect their ego from the sting of self-awareness. But no matter how much rewriting they do, the crack in their narrative does not fully close. It remains, widening with time, because losing a caring person removes the emotional reinforcement that made their grandiosity feel believable. There is no longer someone who listens to their insecurities, rebuilds them after breakdowns, or praises them when they feel inferior. Without that reinforcement, their inflated self-image becomes harder to support. Doubt seeps in, not the type they admit, but the type that keeps them awake, fuels their outbursts, and drives their frantic search to replace you. The collapse of their narrative is not just emotional, it is a disruption of their core identity. Their sense of self becomes shaky, inconsistent, and frantic. They must work twice as hard to maintain a version of themselves that once depended heavily on the emotional grounding you provided. Losing someone who cared means losing the story that shielded them from their own truth. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, they often plunge into a chaotic cycle of distractions, anger, and desperate attempts to reassert control. Not because they deeply miss the person, but because their entire psychological system has been shaken. Their inner world is unstable even under ordinary circumstances. It is held together by external validation, predictable admiration, and the emotional regulation provided by others. When the caring person leaves, the narcissist is left without the emotional glue that kept their internal chaos from taking over. What follows is a rapid, disorganized attempt to outrun the emotional collapse they can sense rising inside them. One of their first reactions is frantic distraction. Narcissists cannot tolerate being alone with their thoughts. Silence exposes the emptiness they've spent their lives avoiding, so they dive into anything that keeps their mind loud. New relationships, excessive work, nonstop social media, impulsive spending, drama, partying, anything that pulls their attention outward. But these distractions don't comfort them. They merely postpone the discomfort. Without the grounding influence of the caring person, every distraction loses effectiveness quickly. The emotional crash they've been avoiding begins creeping closer no matter what they